This week on The Wheelhouse. Farewell, President Joe Biden. How he's spending his final days in office, and how will America remember him? For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse. It's the show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond right here. On January 20th, Joe Biden will close the book on his presidency and pass the torch to President-elect Donald Trump. So what have been Biden's final priorities as president? And what does that tell us about the legacy he hopes to leave behind? That's what we're focusing on this hour, and it's almost like we have a dream team here today. From the Hill, joining me now, Braxton Booker, national political correspondent for Politico. Braxton, great to have you on. Great to see you this morning. You're looking great.
Hey, thanks for having me. You do too, man. You got a bow tie on.
I'm trying to look good, but listen, Braxton, you and I, we're not going to look as great as Lisa Hagen joining us here this morning. How are you today, Lisa?
Hey, Happy New Year, Frankie.
Happy New Year to you as well. Connecticut Mirror and Connecticut Public's shared federal policy reporter. Both of these individuals are very busy right now. How will you remember Joe Biden's work on behalf of the American people? That's the question we're asking all of you folks today. 888-720-9677. 888-720-9677. Former President Barack Obama, Braxton, was famous for reminding the public that there's one president at a time. There's been a lot of attention on President-elect Donald Trump and what he might do once he's sworn into office. Has the spotlight moved off of President Joe Biden in recent weeks? And if so, why?
In recent weeks? I would say recent months.
That's probably good, right?
I mean, this has been a lame duck president ever since he stepped off the presidential ticket back in July and created upended the presidential race. There were times throughout the remainder of the year that we're questioning, what is Biden doing all day? Like, he's not running for president. He was seen very little in the public during the final stretch of the campaign. So for a lot of people, once the election results were in, people were kind of reminded that we still have several weeks to go with President Biden still being in office, and the attention shifted back to him. I think people are going to remember him as a steady hand coming during the beginning or the second year of the pandemic to kind of stabilize the economy and get vaccines into people's arms. Obviously, the vaccine stuff became very, very controversial early part of his presidency and masks and all that. But, as his presidency continued on, the age issue crept up. And fast forward to that first presidential debate between he and Trump, the bottom essentially fell out. And I really think that is going to be what a lot of people remember from his time in office, is like he was the oldest president at the time ever to serve, and he certainly aged before our eyes.
And it only stays warm enough in Rehoboth Beach in Delaware for so long. You can't stay on the beach forever. You got to get back to work. And it sounds like that's what's happened after the stunner in July, as Braxton was pointing out earlier, when President Joe Biden essentially, I don't know if he moved off the ticket or was pushed off, but nonetheless, Politico, where Braxton works, reported across nearly 2 weeks abroad since the election, Biden spoke just 7 words, Lisa, to the media traveling with him. What should we make of this silence?
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly what Braxton said. I mean, he was kind of put in a tough position because, he had to kind of take a back seat with Vice President Kamala Harris running for president. And then once that election didn't go well for Democrats, I mean, Donald Trump kind of immediately filled that void as someone who's coming in as president-elect. And so I think that's kind of what we're seeing over the next, well, now we got matter of days, but in recent weeks, we've seen him kind of trying to shore up his legacy and do some kind of last minute actions, some things that Trump is already vowing to undo. Some of them will be harder to undo than others, but definitely trying to shore up his legacy. And I think, we saw him speak about foreign policy, which he is very knowledgeable in on Monday. And then, I'm curious to hear what he has to say tonight to kind of just, tie a bow and put a pin in his presidency and his one-term presidency tonight.
If you're listening to this on the first run, she's talking about that 8 p.m. Big speech that President Biden is going to have, his final speech. But maybe you want to do something before that. Maybe you want to take somebody on a date or something like that. Or you just want to hang out with a buddy and watch The Wheelhouse live tonight at 6 o'clock at Connecticut Public. We're doing a live version of this show. Braxton and Lisa won't be there, unfortunately. Maybe we'll get them there next year. Maybe Braxton will take Lisa up to Connecticut on his way up here because he's going to be good when he comes through to Connecticut. We'll take care of him. But the Wheelhouse Live is tonight in Hartford, and we're hoping that you'll join us. Just 2 tickets left, ctpublic.org/Frankie. And, man, it's going to be a great night with surprise guests. Oh, man, we're going to have a great conversation. We're going to continue this conversation. But we know what President Joe Biden has been doing across the last couple of weeks, but that trip, I think, was cut short, and there's been some things happening domestically. We had the killing of pedestrians in New Orleans over the New Year's holiday, and, of course, we had the wildfires. So how does that impact what you want to do in the last couple of weeks as president?
Well, certainly you can't plan for natural disasters,
Yes.
or for terrorist attacks, whether they're from domestic actors or international actors, right? So that also becomes politicized in our hyper partisan environment. We've seen with the wildfires, like lots of Republicans kind of like taking over social media, talking about this is what happens when you have Democrats in control. They put too much emphasis on trying to preserve, animals and shrubbery and things like that, and not putting up, making sure they have enough people in place to fight natural disasters, which obviously California has on a yearly basis. And so you see that becoming part of the political landscape. And obviously Biden's going to try to help put in some protections there. But even people are criticizing, is he doing enough with some of the executive orders that he's putting forth to try to help people in California?
And the big thing, I guess, is maybe I'll rephrase it this way. Sure. What can you do in the final days of a presidency? Is it really going to impact anything that Joe Biden's going to be able to do over a 10-day period, a 7-day period? I guess that's the real question here is how much do you do and how much do you prepare for these last couple of days? Even if you want to win and get a second term, maybe he's thinking about June or July trying to run before Kamala Harris replaces him on top of the ticket. Are you starting to set up your final days, a potential lame duck presidency? Is this happening beforehand in the final days?
No, it's certainly happening beforehand. I don't think folks within the White House are scrambling like, man, we got only have a couple of days left. What can we get done? At this point, they're trying to, as Lisa pointed out, try to bolster some of their legacy and try to pass some executive orders that would make it a little more difficult for the incoming President Trump administration to undo. But really, I mean, the attention is primarily now focused on the incoming administration. We saw just yesterday, Republicans on the Senate are already starting their confirmation hearing. So really, this is a formality. Most of federal Washington has turned the page. It's just kind of waiting for the ink to dry on January 20th to see what are the final steps that President Biden is going to do. But for the most part, this is Trump's Washington now. We're all sort of preparing for what that actually means.
Lisa Hagen, you're living in Trump's Washington, essentially. Let's dive into what Joe Biden has been doing in preparation for this transition. Commuting most federal death sentences, correct? And who's benefiting from this?
Yeah, I mean, whenever a president is about to leave office, we're always kind of looking at what kind of clemency he might offer. And so we've seen that already. And I think the big thing, and some people in Connecticut and across the country are benefiting from that. And I think the big thing we're all kind of waiting on, I think this has kind of honestly sucked a lot of oxygen out of the room, is whether he does preemptive pardons. And so, he had pardoned his son, Hunter Biden. That was not preemptive. That got a lot of attention. And so now I think, I'm not sure if we're going to have any specific kind of announcement tonight on prime time. I imagine he's going to completely want to focus that on his legacy. But, we have, again, a matter of days. I think we're waiting to see what he does with preemptive pardons, whether that is for anyone that worked on the January 6th committee that was investigating what had happened when rioters stopped the certification of the 2020 election. Anthony Fauci, who had led the COVID response. I think, all these things are on the table. It's unclear what he's going to do. It has become it's become very politically charged and watched. Past presidents have done it before, so it's not an anomaly. Famously, Ford had pardoned Nixon before leaving office, and so I think that is kind of what we're waiting on right now.
What a time we got to pardon the Dr. Anthony Fauci. Wow, we could talk about that, Braxton, but I want to know about how Republicans, Democrats are responding to these pardons, and then kind of go into follow up on what Lisa was saying. How long these pardons can actually stand, or whether or not there would be some pushback.
There's definitely going to be it's going to be politicized no matter what. But like once a presidential pardon is in place, there's very little that the next president can end up doing, right? Certainly, the pardons also became an issue that ruffled a lot of feathers with Democrats because in December, early December, just weeks after the election, as Lisa mentioned, the president pardoned his son, right? Which, look, nobody's really faulting Biden for doing this. I think folks were expecting this, even though he had been on the record time and again saying he was not going to intervene. But once the election results were where they were, he felt, okay, he's going to move on this. But the fact that he did it in December before he moved on the federal death row folks really rankled a lot of people because it felt like a lot of Democrats felt like they went on a limb trying to protect Biden, parroting what he was saying. Like, of course, he's not going to get involved with this. And then he ultimately did. And you even see like one of the investigators yesterday with the federal investigation take issue with Biden saying that like he overstepped and basically threw federal investigators under the bus by leaning into this and saying it was a political matter when clearly there were some legal issues that should have been investigated, Hunter Biden. But when we get to the January 6th stuff and when we get to folks who were involved with the pandemic, certainly we are expecting the incoming administration to really target folks like Anthony Fauci, anybody who's really in charge of implementing some of those pandemic era safety precautions. So certainly that is what we're looking to see in the next couple of days of whether or not he's going to if he's going to add some protections for those people, so the country can certainly start to just move on from the pandemic era.
I could see where that is very problematic and why people from both sides would be really upset about that. Particularly, let's hone in with Democrats, as you mentioned. It's not just what's happening with the pardons and wanting to make sure that some of these folks on federal death row, even maybe people that are going through this, or the pandemic and the response. There's this Make America Healthy Again movement that is picking up, and certainly people that were actually trying to make the country healthy are not going to be as popular at this point. But there's also folks in the LGBTQ plus community that are hoping for protections and aren't seeing much happening on that front. We're seeing members of Congress on Capitol Hill bragging about rules that they've made to protect, in their words, bathrooms and things like that happening. And the president is looking to protect his son. So could you just continue down that road on other people that might be seeking some action here in the final days?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, just yesterday, the House passed a bill trying to protect women's sports, which obviously became a touch point during not just this past election cycle, but in previous election cycles, because Republicans have used this as a wedge issue and really successfully labeled Democrats as sort of kowtowing to LGBTQ issues instead of, trying to fix the economy for regular everyday Americans. So we are going to see these trans issues kind of continue to percolate in the when the when Trump gets into office. But yes, there are a lot of folks with LGBTQ groups that feel like, look, you came into office promising protections. We've gotten very little. We've gotten representation within the administration, but as far as federal protections, there've not been all that much. Obviously, he was working towards some action late in 2024, and then ultimately moved away from doing that. So, obviously, the last couple of days of his presidency, there's the opportunity to pass some broader protections. But right now, I talked to some LGBTQ groups yesterday. They're trying to find their footing forward, trying to work with different Democratic Party officials that are going to be in office well beyond President Biden's term, to figure out if there's some legislative action that could be taken either on the federal level or in the states.
Thank you for that work, Braxton. And we at Connecticut Public are going to be paying attention to LGBTQ plus rights, trans rights, and, of course, reproductive rights in the coming year. So please stay tuned to the Wheelhouse. I want to switch gears to Lisa and student loan debt, a central focus of Biden's administration. Is he doing anything to address that in the final weeks in office? I know we're hearing that potentially we might not see more forgiveness in the next administration. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, this has been, I think, a really big area for him and his administration, including Miguel Cardona, who is the Secretary of Education from Connecticut. And so, yeah, they've been kind of, I think, trying to shore up and cement that legacy on student loan debt. We've seen kind of in the last final days a little bit more debt relief. It's very targeted, though, so it's on public service loan forgiveness program. So anyone who's been in public service, we're seeing dismissal of more of those loans. I think for some people who are disabled. And so again, it's all very targeted relief. I think, most notable in, when you look at his legacy on student loan debt, I think the administration has said they've done 28 different debt relief actions since he took office. But again, notably, the most sweeping one, the one that would have erased anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000 of, student debt, it got blocked by the Supreme Court. And there were hundreds of thousands of people in Connecticut who would have been eligible for that, obviously many more around the country. And that got struck down. And so, that will always be, a little bit part of that legacy. But, they're really trying to tout the fact that they are doing what they can to help younger people and older people, too, who have had debt for a while.
Lisa, let's go down this road. Something that Bilal Siku, a friend of ours from the University of Hartford, said on this show last week that really stuck with me is, particularly in Connecticut, where we know how hard it is to fix housing policy, as it is down there in D.C., we know about the discrepancy between some parts of Virginia and Maryland compared to Washington, D.C. proper, the achievement gap, as it were. In order to fix this, some folks are thinking that you have to take a holistic approach. So maybe you fix, in order to get somebody housing, maybe it's that you don't necessarily give them the housing stock. Maybe first you're able to forgive some of their student loans. Maybe you're able to forgive their medical debt. So tell me about how important of a component of this as well, medical debt and improving credit scores is to helping young people, helping old people, and helping the economy.
Yeah, that's another thing that I think the administration has tried to do in, again, final days, final weeks is you not able to, take into account medical debt from appearing on your credit reports. And so a lot of the times when you're seeing any kind of debt and loans that you have that could impact your credit report, that can prevent you from getting a mortgage. So therefore, again, housing being a very big deal, that could impact you getting a car loan, any kind of thing that you're seeking. The fact that you could be having student debt or medical debt could be taken into account and can block you from getting that relief. And so the administration, through the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, had removed billions of dollars for millions of people basically from appearing on their credit report. And so, again, these are all final actions. I don't know if for what the Trump administration will do. It's totally possible they will want to reverse these things. And I think, as I said before, as a caveat, some things can be easily reversible when you get a new administration come through. Other times, they might have to go through the courts. They might have to go through Congress. So I think that's the biggest thing, is that Biden is trying to, again, cement his legacy. We will see what the Trump administration wants to do on those last minute actions.
Brackton, anything you want to say about what you've been hearing on the Hill regarding that, and any other last-minute things here that are happening on the Capitol Hill, any kind of last-minute priorities?
Well, look, what I'm hearing from a lot of Democrats is they're really just trying to figure out what the next steps are, not just with debt and trying to protect folks, but also like, what is this resistance going to look like once Trump is in office? There seems to be like the Democratic Party is in a little bit of a disarray. So, the last couple of days of the Biden administration, they're really trying to solidify and try to get on the same page as far as like how they are going to set themselves up to be a foil or resistance to the incoming Trump administration. And it's unclear kind of how they are going to push forward on that. So, right now, I think that, as we're talking about the final days of the Biden administration, it's certainly important to figure out how he's going to try to shape his legacy, particularly in this speech tonight, as he sort of leaves the country with the last moments of him with the trappings of the presidency around him. But as soon as he steps off camera, his legacy and his thought of him being in the White House is really going to move forward to see where the Democratic Party moves on from here. And look, they're going to be picking their DNC chair in the coming weeks. So really, it's the party has certainly moved in a lot of ways beyond this presidency, and that's where they're headed now.
One headline I saw this morning, Lisa, was that President Joe Biden has aimed to become the president that has protected the most land. So let's talk about the environment. Biden focusing on this during his last few weeks here in office. Energy on drilling leases as well. He's trying to focus on climate change initiatives as well. So tell me about those changes there, Lisa.
Yeah, again, I think he's trying to cement his legacy on climate. And so, something where we saw a lot of investments from the administration was through the Inflation Reduction Act. And again, that's something that's going to be highly targeted by Republicans, either in trying to, again, undo parts of that legislation, maybe repurposing funds that were used for climate. And so, again, in terms of things we're seeing in the final days and final weeks, is basically ending new offshore drilling. And so, again, these are things that presidents have done before. Even President Trump had done that in his first administration, though in a much smaller capacity. And so this one from President Biden is pretty expansive. It really kind of blocks drilling off much of the East Coast, West Coast, other parts. And so there's, I think as people are assessing this and kind of dissecting it, people say that it's maybe a little bit more symbolic because some of these areas that he's blocked from drilling are less desirable, basically, for drilling at this point. But nonetheless, it is something that actually could potentially be a bit more binding. Again, we've been talking about what Trump can undo. This is something that actually would be a lot harder for him to come in day one and say, we're going to reverse this. We're going to allow new drilling leases in this area. Courts, it's a lot harder to kind of go through legal paths to undo this. And so I don't know if this is something that Congress takes up, but maybe symbolic, but something that actually we could see for quite some time.
That's Lisa Hagan, federal policy reporter for Connecticut Mirror and Connecticut Public. Brackton Booker still on your screen, national political correspondent for Politico. They're going to stick with us. Tell us what you think of Biden's final days in office. Really quickly, I'm going to tell you folks, we got 2 tickets left to the Wheelhouse Live tonight in Hartford. It's at our studios. Want to make sure that everyone is able to get there. Just 2 tickets left, as I mentioned. It's at 6 o'clock. Go to ctpublic.org/Frankie. 3 surprise guests, plus our great show regulars, Susan Raff, Mark Pazniokas, and Bilal Siku. So go to ctpublic.org/Frankie. Back in a second, talking about drilling leases to drilling down on foreign policy. Stay tuned with the Wheelhouse. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. Earlier this week, President Joe Biden delivered his final foreign policy address. I'm such a professional. Here to talk through what he said, Lisa Hagan, Connecticut Mirror and Connecticut Public's shared federal policy reporter, and Braxton Booker, national political correspondent for Politico. And let us know, folks, if you're out there, what you think about Biden's speech on foreign policy, or how you're going to remember Biden's time in office, maybe how you're prepping for the next administration. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Much of President Biden's speech focused on what his administration sees as wins during his 4 years in office, including how he handled the war between Russia and Ukraine. In his opinion, let's listen to the clip.
Today, I can report to the American people, our adversaries are weaker than were when we came into this job 4 years ago. Just consider Russia. When Putin invaded Ukraine, he thought he'd conquer Kyiv in a matter of days. But the truth is, since that war began, I'm the only one that stood in the center of Kyiv, not him. Putin never had.
A very triumphant tone there from the president. How is Biden thinking on his administration's response to Russia's war in Ukraine? Sounds like he's happy about it, Lisa.
Yeah, no, he definitely took a victory lap on that. In his 4 years, he's had to deal with a number of crises abroad. And so, and Russia invading Ukraine being one of them. And so definitely took a bit of a victory lap on that. And I think, that was intentional, not just to show, what progress has been made or the fact that, Russia has not taken over Kyiv, but, the fact that they are going to be handing this off and frankly, everything in his foreign policy portfolio to the Trump administration, where I think they are definitely worried and concerned how the Trump administration will handle that going forward. And so putting a pretty big spotlight on that. I mean, again, he ticked through a number of things, including some parts of his, foreign policy handling that, didn't, were not as big of bright spots, but, that being, I think, one of them for him.
Also talked about how much money he was able to, and Congress was able to get over to Ukraine as well. And that wasn't very popular from the people on the other side of the aisle. And this isn't either what I'm about to have you listen to, Braxton. President Biden talking about his decision to withdraw troops from Afghanistan. Here's what he said.
So when I took office, I had a choice. Ultimately, I saw no reason to keep thousands of servicemen in Afghanistan. In my view, it was time to end the war and bring our troops home, and we did.
This was an incredible proposition to try to end a long-standing war, try to bring troops back, and do something that Biden is saying that a previous administration left for him. So you take all of that, Braxton, and try to unpack it.
That's a lot to unpack there. A 20-year war he will be given credit for ending the longest war in U.S. history. I mean, I think just that statement is a fact there. Now, how it came to be is really a question that is up to debate. Republicans had hammered him for saying, like, look, we don't disagree with you, President Biden, on ending this war, but don't set a date. If you set a date, that's when the Taliban knows that they can go in and basically take over everything because they are just counting down the days for the U.S. departure. And in a lot of ways, that came to fruition because we saw how chaotic the final days were when we were pulling out of Afghanistan and Kabul especially, where the Taliban and U.S. troops got into, exchanging a fire, and some service members were killed, which he sort of glossed over in that foreign policy address that he had. He acknowledged that people lost their lives, but kind of framed it in the greater good of ending that war. So I do not think that it's going to be something that is going to be tarnishing of his legacy. But I mean, I'm just thinking it is kind of apropos that just last week, this president, as well as former presidents, were all in attendance to another one-term president, and Jimmy Carter, paying their final respects. And a lot of people were drawing parallels to what happened in Iran, to what happened in the final days of Afghanistan. And look, I do think that he did move foreign policy along. He at least closed the chapter for the U.S., but it is going to be a blemish on his record just in handling of it, and a lot of people looking at that time period and saying like this could have been handled a lot differently if perhaps he didn't give the end date of when we were going to pull out all U.S. service personnel.
And you look to your president for responsibility and accountability, and it sounds like there was an opportunity for that, and glossed over is an important term I'd like to point people to that Braxton mentioned there. Biden also addressing the Israel-Hamas conflict and a plan, but gave little detail beyond that. Here's what he actually said. Lisa, listen to this one.
The deal we have structured would free the hostages, halt the fighting, provide security to Israel, and allow us to significantly surge humanitarian assistance to the Palestinians who've suffered terribly in this war that Hamas started. They've been through hell. So many innocent people have been killed.
What do you make of those comments, Lisa? What's the likelihood that we see this plan come to fruition within the next couple of days?
Yeah, I was listening to that speech, and obviously this will be a big touchstone of his foreign policy legacy. And I was kind of waiting for him to address it and didn't know when it was going to come up. And so it got towards the end, and I think it was a bit more, again, future focused. He's talked about this conflict quite a bit, and so he really focused on the ceasefire deal. And again, I think that was on purpose because it is something that potentially we could see come to fruition very soon. But does it happen in the next few days while he's still president? Does it happen by next week when he is no longer president, and President-elect Trump potentially gets credit for it, whether or not he was integral in it at all? We've seen this before, though. We've seen this where things are in the middle of getting handed off from one president to another, and a lot of politics happens.
I'm not ugging at President Donald Trump. I want to make sure we're neutral here. What I'm ugging at is something that Braxton also alluded to earlier when we were talking about Iran. Why does this something that continues to happen where people's lives, and I know Ronald Reagan still gets credit to this for this day, but I think this is abhorrent, is that there was a deal contingent on whether or not Ronald Reagan would be president. And now, Lisa, I know you're not exactly saying this, but this is something that people are watching in real time. They're wondering whether or not the Trump presidency hinges on this as well. And I don't know, Braxton, take us somewhere on this. Like, that's what I'm ugging at. Like, these are people really lives in danger. And certainly Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu, has been getting a ton of criticism from people in Israel and people across the world for how this is all being handled.
Well, look, this is extremely complicated, obviously, and this is a matter of life and death, literally. But when you're looking at the politics of it all, I mean, you can see as we were talking, there seems to be some evidence that the ceasefire deal is imminent. But as Lisa was talking about, does it come together now? Does it come together next week? Where Trump could take credit for saying, like, look, world powers they expect us. With a Trump in office, he is stabilizing the world, which is part of his campaign promise. Like, he needed to get back into the White House because there were very little or no foreign wars during his time in office. That is his claim, anyway. And so it really hinges on. I know the Biden administration is really working hard to secure this, to have this be like a feather in the cap on their way out, to hand Trump, some stabilization of the Middle East. But this is so politically wrought. I mean, part of the reason why Democrats had such a tough time in 2024 was because of Biden's handling of the Israel-Hamas situation, right? You saw people within the Democratic Party take issue because he didn't want to call what was happening there a genocide, what was happening in Gaza. And that lost him a ton of support, especially in the Midwest, where you saw the uncommitted movement move against the Democratic Party because of their kind of unflinching support of Israel. So this, like I said, is wrought with politics. So even if there is a ceasefire deal in the coming days, this has far-reaching political implications about how the parties continue to move as we kind of head into 2025 and further into 2026, and whether or not Democrats can even get those people back who either broke for the party and supported Donald Trump, or just sat out from politics altogether. So that is also going to be part of Biden's legacy for kind of ushering in this fracturing of the Democratic Party.
Certainly understandable that there's a tone that has to be struck in these last few days, but acknowledging lives lost from these hostages as well, and their families that are upset, and similarly, maybe even more importantly, in terms of the amount of loss, the casualties, as you mentioned, the amount of people, the civilians that are dying in Gaza. And I would imagine that that's something that continues to impact Biden here in the final days. As Braxton mentioned, we saw the election results over in the Midwest of this country. But switching one last time to talk about energy and the Paris Climate Accords, this is a lot of things that folks are watching now. We certainly had a survey recently at Connecticut Public, and a lot of our listeners said that they care about climate change. And an effort that President Joe Biden undertook after getting into the White House was reversing some of these moves that Donald Trump made to distance himself from the Paris Climate Accords. What might happen to this, plus other climate policies pushed by Biden? Lisa mentioned earlier the Inflation Reduction Act.
Yeah, I can take this one.
Yeah, that was for Braxton. Sorry, I messed up that toss. You go ahead, Braxton.
Oh yeah. Look, I think especially with the Paris Climate Accords, as quickly as Biden brought the U.S. back to the climate accords, I think we can really expect that once Trump is back in office, we're going to be ushered right back out of those climate talks. So, look, I think that folks who are in the kind of environmental justice space are really worried about what the incoming Trump administration is going to bring. So, perhaps like what Lisa was alluding to earlier in our conversation, there could be some more executive orders that could help usher in some of these protections. But this does not seem like it has a long shelf life beyond January 20th. So I'm not holding out much hope that the U.S. is, at least in the early part of the Trump administration, that a lot of these policies are going to survive.
Lisa, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, exactly what Braxton said. And, I thought it was interesting that, in a foreign policy speech, Biden took time to address climate as such, as a really major threat. And that's just something I just don't think we're going to hear the Trump administration talk about in that kind of way. And, I think he had said something like, they are dead wrong on, even just whether they believe climate change is real. And so I think Biden was really trying to set that up and kind of, again, hand off to the Trump administration. But I think we're going to see a lot of backtracking on this issue and just not being talked about even as a national security threat.
We're talking to Braxton Booker, national political correspondent for Politico, and of course, Lisa Hagen, good friend of mine at Connecticut Public and CT Mirror. They're on today's show, and there's another show tonight. It's a two-suit kind of day for me. I got one on now, another one later, and that one, it's probably going to turn some heads. I'm going to probably get into a conversation about how it might be a faux pas, but whatever. We'll see what happens. Hopefully our guests at the Wheelhouse Live will vibe with it. You can judge my style choices, too. I'll give you permission to do it if you buy a ticket for this event. 2 tickets left. If you haven't snagged one yet, head to ctpublic.org/Frankie. Excited to see Wheelhouse listeners a bit later today. Maybe some radio hugs, maybe a chance to throw Ollie out there. It's going to be a great time. After the break, we're going to talk about Joe Biden's legacy. How might Americans remember his presidency in 10 or 20 years? And how might our 46th president spend his retirement years? You can join the conversation. 888-720-9677. 888-720-9677. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano, joining you this morning here on The Wheelhouse, closing the book on Joe Biden's presidency this hour. Still with me, Lisa Hagan, federal policy reporter for Connecticut Mirror and Connecticut Public, and Braxton Booker, national political correspondent for Politico. Man, it's been too long since I talked to Braxton. That's all I'm seeing and understanding here. I'm so glad to talk to you today. So glad that you're giving us some time, especially you too, Lisa, with all the busy things that you're doing as you transition from one Congress to the next here and covering this. I want to know how folks, though, are going to remember President Joe Biden's leadership. Tell us. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Lisa, the big challenge that Biden inherited domestically, COVID-19 and the pandemic. I'm wondering how that public health crisis plays its way into how Americans will remember him.
Yeah, I think it's hard. It's a challenge for him and just for everyone. It's really changed in how we've seen the pandemic. I mean, we're, a number of years out now. And I think, at the time, at least when it is still the Trump administration, there were bipartisan efforts to get pandemic relief done. And then, they'd done a decent amount of packages, and eventually Republicans didn't want to do any more spending. And so Biden comes into office, and then they basically do like a party line final major tranche of pandemic funding. And so, the party has defended their decision to do that as, hey, it was needed at the time. We needed to buoy families, small businesses, get them through this really unpredictable and, quite unprecedented time. And so, but, as pandemic got pretty politicized, there was continued closures of schools. It's hard. I think they're still reckoning with how Americans think of that time and pandemic funding. Experts also say that, because they were doing intense amount of spending, it probably led in part to contributing to inflation. So I think there's, mixed reviews on that. But, I think we're also, states like Connecticut are, dealing with the ramifications of a lot of that pandemic funding ending, schools seeing less of that funding. And so I think, as much as that's become politicized, I think states are kind of reckoning with the fact that they now have to plug holes. And, that was funding that really got them through a hard time.
The mental psyche that the pandemic, the impact that it had on all of our psyches. And then as Lisa is talking about, now you're talking about education stood up by ARPA dollars. We'll always remember that that four-letter phrase there, ARPA. But now those dollars are all spoken for. So a lot of these states that are now having to cope with not just a public health crisis, but now a mental health crisis are dealing with the ramifications of that. Thank you for bringing that up, Lisa. During these final days in office, President Biden focusing a lot of his rhetoric and messaging on the importance of preserving democracy, Braxton. For instance, on January 5th, he wrote an opinion piece for the Washington Post imploring people to not forget the Capitol insurrection. A lot of people thought that was an interesting thing to do, to go to the old playbook here and maybe dial up the old opinion piece.
Yeah. Look, I'm not sure how many people outside of politicos who really are engaged in and reading opinion pieces we're really swayed by that, right? I think like with everything that we've seen in politics in recent years, even that has certainly gotten politicized, right? Like the Democrats ran on a platform of you have to stop Trump to save democracy. But in the end, you could also make the argument that democracy worked because folks turned out in record numbers to vote, right? And people decided that they wanted Trump back in office. And what we're going to see next week is going to be a peaceful transfer of power, and Biden's going to be there, to do the handoff, unlike what Trump did with him 4 years ago, right? And so in some ways, his actions of helping preserve democracy probably not going to make a ton of footnotes in our nation's history, but it is a continuation of look, democracy held. We did not have wide scale riots that some were predicting after the election if it would have gone either way. But look, preserving democracy is still something that Democrats feel very strongly about and feel like that is a rallying cry for their party. I do think that look, democracy is complicated. Democracy is also something that has to be worked at all the time. And because we're at such polarizing times, parties have to learn how to evolve and try to figure out and define what democracy means. So, what his legacy is on democracy is that like it held. We did not have these full scale riots like we did in 2021. So kudos on him for helping kind of preserve that. But I mean, I think moving forward, the democracy argument is probably not going to be as prevalent in Democratic circles because they ran on that platform and didn't do well at the ballot box at the presidential level. So they're going to have to kind of shift their focus into something else. So that is sort of what I'm thinking about as far as democracy and Biden's attachment to it.
Not necessarily shifting the focus, but widening the lens. Pardon the camera puns. This is President Lisa, who spent 55 plus years in public service. He's able to eulogize President Carter and talk about how they work together. He's a popular senator and vice president, but an unpopular president, at least according to some polling. How do we square those things, and what could that tension mean for how he's remembered?
Yeah, I think especially for President Biden, talking about 55 years in public service, I think that ended up being a double-edged sword for him because it showed his age and the fact that he's been in this for a really long time. But obviously, when it comes to things like, as he spoke about on Monday, foreign policy, that gave him the time to really get to know allies and other world leaders. And so I think it both worked for and against him a little bit. But, I think the fact that we were just, mourning and eulogizing, Jimmy Carter, it's really emblematic of the fact that, he is going to be another one-term president. And those can be really complicated legacies. And so, it's easy, or it's in fact hard to kind of think about Biden and his legacy in this time because, things are so polarized and we're still kind of parsing through. But, I will be curious to know years and decades from now, like, does he kind of fare the same fate as, thinking back to Jimmy Carter, where we're thinking of him more positively and we're kind of forgetting some of those blemishes on his record? Or is he just a product of the fact that this is, again, a really polarized, gridlock time and, that might hold?
Do we know anything about what the president plans to do next, guys? Jump in if you got it. Besides maybe getting on the beach in Rehoboth?
I think that's exactly it.
Yeah. I mean, I think he's going to enjoy his time in Delaware.
Yeah, I would too. I'll be fair to the president there. It's a very nice area of the country, nonetheless. And what's even nicer is Capitol Hill when these two are working there. Braxton Booker, national political correspondent for Politico. Braxton, so great to have you back on. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me. It's great time.
Also been listening to Lisa Hagan, federal policy reporter for Connecticut Public and CT Mirror. I miss her down there in Capitol. Hope to have her back soon, but thank you so much for joining us this hour.
Thanks so much, Frankie.
The Wheelhouse Live is the last thing we're going to talk about. It's going to be lit tonight in our studios in Hartford. 2 tickets left. Somebody snag those last 2 tickets. ctpublic.org/Frankie. Surprise guests. Man, these are going to hit, these surprise guests. Your favorite show regulars, Susan Raff, Mark Pasniokis, Bilal Siku. And if you didn't grab a ticket in time, don't worry. We'll be airing part of the event on the Wheelhouse soon. Today's show produced by Chloe Wynn, edited by Robin Doyen-Aiken. Our technical producer is the maestro, Dylan Reyes. Download the Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse. Thank you for listening.